My name is Cassandra Whitmore. I am 34 years old, and on the Saturday, my sister walked down the aisle in a dress that cost $11,000, surrounded by 47 guests who had been told I was too emotionally volatile to include. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Harlan, Virginia, watching a bank officer slide a formal foreclosure notice across the mahogany table toward my family's estate attorney. The notice was embossed with the letterhead of Meridian Capital Partners. That was my company. The debt it described, $9.4 million, secured against the Whitmore family estate, belonged to my brother. The collateral, the 11-acre property, the main house, the 2 outbuildings, the south lawn, where at that precise moment, 112 people were drinking champagne from crystal flutes and watching my sister become a married woman. All of it sat inside the legal perimeter of that document. And the document was mine. I did not smile. I did not lean back in my chair with any air of triumph. I folded my hands on the table and said, quietly, "Please ensure the Whitmore family receives the standard 72-hour notice. Nothing more, nothing less. I want the process handled exactly as it would be for any other borrower." The bank officer nodded. The estate attorney, a man named Philip Hartley, sat across from me with the color draining from his face the way water drains from a bathtub, slowly at first, and then all at once. What he didn't know, what none of them had known for 38 months, was that I had not left the Whitmore family behind. I had positioned myself around it. Every decision made in silence, every document filed without a phone call home, every meeting held in offices far enough from Harlan County that no one who recognized my last name would wander past and ask what I was working on. I had been patient in the way that only becomes possible once you have accepted, finally and completely, that patience is not the same as waiting. Patience is building, while no one is watching. And I had built something they could not ignore. This is that story. But before I take you all the way back to the beginning, to the engagement dinner and the unopened bottle of Barolo and the kitchen sink where I first understood what I was going to do, I want to know where you are. Right now, this moment, wherever this voice is reaching you. What city, what country, what hour of the day or night? Drop it in the comments. I find it extraordinary, genuinely, that a story like this one travels across time zones and finds the people who need it. If you are someone who has been called non-priority by your own family, if you know what it is to drive hours to a dinner and be asked to put your gift in the kitchen, if you have ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood and felt completely invisible, this channel is for you. Like this video if it is finding you where you are. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one comes. And now let me take you back. The Whitmore family estate sat on 11 acres outside Harlan County, Virginia. It was the kind of property that photographs well from a distance and reveals its complications up close. A 14-room main house with a wraparound porch, 2 outbuildings that had been converted from agricultural use into a small event space and a guest cottage, and grounds that my mother, Vivian Elaine Whitmore, 62 years old, tended with the same precise, controlling attention she applied to every other element of her life. The estate had been in the family since my grandfather's generation. My father, Douglas Whitmore, 66, and largely absent since his second stroke, had built his professional reputation as a commercial real estate developer partly on the weight of that name and that property. In Harlan County, the Whitmore estate was a landmark. My mother understood this and used it accordingly. Vivienne was not an unkind woman. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in a story like this one, and imprecision is a form of dishonesty. She did not raise her voice. She did not play favorites in any obvious or theatrical way. What she did, what she had done for as long as I could remember, was allocate. She managed her family the way a careful administrator manages a limited budget, with priority lists and efficiency assessments, and a clear sense of where the return on investment was most likely to justify the expenditure. My brother Garrett was the investment that had justified itself most consistently. He was 38. He had my father's bearing and my father's confidence. And from the time he was 22 years old, he had been the designated successor of Whitmore Holdings, the family's commercial real estate arm. My mother allocated resources to Garrett the way a gardener allocates water to a plant she has already decided will bear fruit. My sister Noelle, 30 years old, auburn-haired, and effortlessly graceful, was allocated differently. Noelle was not an asset exactly. She was more like a flagship, the visible face of a brand, the thing you put forward when you want people to feel that everything is beautiful and well-managed and worth admiring. Noelle received attention in the way that a public garden receives attention, maintained for its appearance, admired by visitors, its upkeep considered part of the family's investment in its own image. My mother loved Noelle the way people love beautiful things, reflexively, publicly, without needing to think about it. And then there was me, Cassandra, the eldest, the one who had left. In my mother's ledger, I was a line item that had been transferred to a different column. No longer a dependent, not quite an asset, hovering in a category that might generously be called independent and therefore low maintenance. She spoke of me at family gatherings with a tone that combined mild pride with mild bafflement, as though I were a distant relative who had turned out reasonably well despite some unconventional choices. "Cassandra is doing her own thing up north," she would say. "You know how she is." The people she said it to nodded as though they did, and I was filed away. I need to give you 2 examples so that you understand that this is not my interpretation of events, but a documented pattern with specific incidents attached to it. The first. I was 27. I had just closed my first major loan acquisition at Prescott Capital Group, a distressed hotel property in the Shenandoah Valley, assessed at $2.8 million, acquired for $1.1. It was my deal entirely. I had found it, underwritten it, negotiated it across 9 months of patient work, and closed it on a Tuesday morning in November. My boss, Warren Schofield, took me to dinner at a steakhouse in Richmond that evening, and told me, with the specificity of a man who did not distribute praise generously, that it was the cleanest acquisition the firm had executed from an analyst under 30 in recent memory. I drove home afterward and sat in my parking space for a while just absorbing it. Then I called my mother. I explained the deal in plain terms, what a distressed asset acquisition was, what the hotel property represented, what the acquisition meant for my trajectory at the firm. She listened. She said, at the end, "That's very impressive, darling. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. Noelle is doing a kitchen remodel, and she's having trouble matching the original tile. You spent some time in Richmond. Do you know anyone in the trades up there?" I told her I would look into it. I spent 20 minutes the following week finding 3 tile contractors in the Richmond area and emailing her their contact information. None of them were ever mentioned again. The second. I was 29. Prescott named me a partner, the youngest in the firm's history. I sent my parents a handwritten card with a note inside explaining what the partnership meant, because I genuinely wanted them to understand the significance of it. 3 weeks later, Garrett emailed me asking whether my partnership agreement included any provisions for outside investment, because he had a development project he was capitalizing and was exploring options. He did not mention the card, he did not mention the partnership. He had read about it and identified it, within 3 weeks, as a potential resource. I did not respond to the email for 4 days. Then I wrote back, professionally, explaining that Prescott's partnership agreements included standard conflict of interest restrictions that limited outside investment. He replied, "Got it, thanks. I do not tell you these things to make my family sound like villains. They are not villains. They are people who developed, over decades, a set of assumptions about who I was and what role I served, and who never revisited those assumptions because no one and nothing had given them a compelling reason to do so." The Whitmore family was not cruel. It was incurious. And incuriosity, applied consistently and over time to a person who is trying to be known, is its own kind of damage. The accumulation of it, the dinners where your news becomes a pivot to someone else's request, the phone calls where your accomplishments are noted and then immediately repurposed as instruments. It does something to you. It teaches you to make yourself smaller in rooms where you were always already small, and then to be surprised when no one can find you. I stopped being surprised sometime around my 30th birthday. That was the year I left Prescott and started Meridian Capital Partners with Diane Forsyth and Tobias Reeves. Before I tell you about Meridian, I need to tell you about Prescott, because those 4 years were the foundation of everything that followed. And I want you to understand that none of what I built happened by accident or by luck or by a single clever decision. It happened because I paid attention every day to things that other people in the room were not paying attention to. Prescott Capital Group was a boutique commercial lending firm in Richmond. 12 people, serious work, the kind of place where the senior analysts had earned their credibility over decades and did not distribute it casually. I was hired as a junior analyst at 24 and assigned to the workout division, which meant I spent my days studying what happens when commercial real estate loans go wrong. I learned the mechanics of default, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived process, with a specific sequence of events and legal thresholds and decision points, each one carrying its own implications for the borrower and the lender, and whoever might be positioned between them. I learned to read a borrower's financial history the way a doctor reads a chart, looking not just at the numbers, but at the pattern, the pace of deterioration, the moments when decisions were made that compounded rather than corrected a problem. I was good at it, not because I had a particular gift for finance in the abstract, but because I had spent my childhood in a family that managed resources with careful attention to priority and return, and I understood instinctively the psychology of people who are in over their heads and hoping no one will notice until they can find a way out. I had grown up watching that hope in operation. I knew what it looked like from the inside. By my 4th year at Prescott, I was the analyst with the highest close rate in the workout division. Warren Schofield, the division head, was not a man given to praise, which made his praise, when it came, legible as signal rather than noise. He told me, after one particularly complex acquisition, closed at terms I had negotiated personally, that I had a talent for understanding what the other side needed to believe in order to agree to something. I thought about that for a long time. I think it was the most accurate professional assessment anyone has ever given me. That was the year I left Prescott and started Meridian Capital Partners with Diane Forsyth and Tobias Reeves. Diane had been a senior credit analyst for 12 years. Methodical, precise, unhurried, the kind of person who flags a discrepancy in a financial model the way most people flag a misspelling, with calm certainty and no drama. Tobias was a commercial real estate attorney with a decade of practice behind him and a particular talent for negotiation that looked, from the outside, exactly like patient listening. Together, the three of us had a skill set that was complementary in a way that felt designed. Meridian's focus was distressed loan acquisition. We identified commercial loans in or approaching default, acquired them at a discount from the originating lenders, and then worked with borrowers toward resolution, or, where resolution was not achievable, toward the orderly transfer of assets. It was not glamorous work. It was, however, precise and consequential and remunerative, and it was mine in a way that nothing had been mine before. 51% ownership in a firm I had co-founded, with my name on the masthead and my judgment at the center of every major decision. By the end of our 2nd year, Meridian managed a portfolio of distressed loan acquisitions across 4 states with a total book value of $61 million. By the end of our 3rd year, we had 15 employees and offices in Richmond and 1 in Roanoke. We had a reputation in the regional commercial lending community for being thorough, professional, and effective. We were known specifically for the quality of our due diligence, the care with which we understood not just the financial structure of a distressed loan, but the human architecture of the situation behind it. I insisted on that care. I had personal reasons for understanding that the numbers are always, eventually, a story about people. My family did not know any of this, not because I had hidden it exactly, but because they had never asked. And I had by then stopped volunteering. The breaking point, the dinner that ended things, came in September, 3 years ago. Noelle had announced her engagement to a man named Fletcher Oakes, 36, handsome, venture-backed, the kind of man who wore his ambition lightly and aimed it carefully. The engagement dinner was held at the estate. I drove 4 hours from Richmond. I had called ahead to confirm I was expected. I had been told, "Yes, of course, darling, we would love to see you," and had I heard that Noelle's ring was absolutely extraordinary. I brought a bottle of Barolo, $82, selected specifically because Noelle had mentioned once that it was Fletcher's favorite varietal. I had looked it up. I had stopped at 2 different wine shops to find the right producer. I wrapped it in tissue and placed it carefully on the passenger seat for the drive south so it would not shift. I arrived at 6:47 in the evening. My mother answered the door. She looked at the bottle in my hands and said, "How thoughtful. Put it in the kitchen." She turned and walked back into the living room. I stood on the porch step for a moment, just a moment, taking in the sound of voices inside and the smell of the catered dinner my mother had ordered, and the fact that the word hello had not been part of our exchange. Then I walked to the kitchen and set the bottle on the counter beside a case of wine Garrett had brought, already open, already being poured. Mine stayed sealed for the entire evening. I found it still there, unopened, when I went to get my coat. At dinner, my father made a toast. He toasted Noelle and Fletcher. He toasted Garrett's continued work at the holdings. He toasted my mother for holding the family together through difficult months. He set his glass down and my mother began cutting her lamb, and the conversation moved on. My name had not been spoken. Not once during the entire evening. I had sat at the table, eaten the catered food, passed the bread basket, laughed at appropriate moments, and been as invisible as a piece of furniture that has been arranged in its usual place. After the dinner, while Garrett and Fletcher discussed the estate's east parcels and the neighboring families who had come for dessert gathered around Noelle to admire her ring, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink beside my mother, both of us rinsing Crystal. I said, "Mom, I drove 4 hours to be here tonight," she said without turning from the sink. "We know, darling. Traffic on the 44 can be terrible this time of year." I waited a beat and then said, "I'd like to be more involved. Going forward, I'd like to feel less like a guest in this house." She set a glass on the drying rack, turned off the tap, said, in the tone of someone explaining a reasonable administrative decision to a junior colleague, "Cassandra, we love you, but you've built your life somewhere else. We've all had to adjust. We can't really organize around people who have chosen not to be here." I dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I looked at the back of her silver gray head. I said, "Okay, Mom," 2 words, perfectly level. Then I drove 4 hours home in the dark, and I did not cry until I was past the county line. And when I was done crying, I sat in a rest stop parking lot outside Charlottesville for 14 minutes. And then I pulled back onto the highway, and by the time I reached my apartment, I had made a decision that I would not discuss with anyone, not even Diane, not even Tobias, for a long time. I was going to know everything about the Whitmore family's finances, and then I was going to wait. It took me less than 1 afternoon to begin. I had the access, the training, and the methodology. County property records are public. Loan filings on commercial real estate, when they are secured against real property, are recorded at the county clerk's office and searchable. I pulled the Whitmore Holdings filings on a Sunday afternoon in October, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the focused attention of someone who has learned to read financial documents the way other people read weather forecasts, for what they tell you about what is coming. Garrett had borrowed $9.4 million from Blue Ridge Horizon Bank 18 months prior. The loan was secured against the family estate, appraised at $14.2 million at the time of origination. The purpose of the loan was the development of a mixed-use residential and retail project called Cloverfield Commons, 40 acres, 22 residential units, 11 commercial bays, projected to break ground the previous spring. I cross-referenced the project with the Harlan County Planning Commission records. The project had not broken ground in the spring. It had not broken ground at all. The retail anchor tenant, a regional grocery chain, had withdrawn from the letter of intent in April. The residential pre-sales were, based on a prospectus I found filed with the state securities regulator, 41% below projection. I called Diane the following Monday morning. I said, "I need you to look at something." I did not explain. She did not ask. By Thursday of that week, Diane had completed a preliminary credit analysis on the Blue Ridge Horizon loan. By the following Tuesday, I was on a call with a senior loan officer at Blue Ridge Horizon's workout division. The bank was, as I had suspected from the filing pattern, already considering its options. The loan had missed 1 interest payment. The internal review had begun. We moved carefully. Meridian Capital Partners submitted a formal acquisition inquiry for the distressed note in the 3rd week of October. We conducted our due diligence over 4 weeks, reviewing the original loan file, the appraisal, the project financials, the borrower's credit history, the regulatory status of Cloverfield Commons. On the 2nd Thursday of December, we closed the acquisition. Loan number BRH7741W transferred from Blue Ridge Horizon Bank to Meridian Capital Partners at a discount that reflected the elevated default risk. The family estate, all 11 acres and every structure on it, was now collateral on a debt owed to my company. I told no one, not Tobias, not Renata, not anyone. Diane knew only that we had acquired a distressed residential development note in Harlan County. She did not know whose name was on the underlying holding company. She was professional enough not to need to. I spent the next 4 months doing exactly what I had always done. I worked. I managed Meridian's portfolio. I ran along the river 3 mornings a week in the early dark, when the city was still quiet and the water caught the first edge of light. I had dinner with Tobias and his wife on Fridays when the week permitted. I planted herbs on my kitchen windowsill and checked them every morning, because there is something clarifying about tending to a living thing that does not know your last name or your family's expectations of you. I lived my life with the deliberateness of someone who has accepted that the present moment is the only one she can control, and that controlling it well is its own form of readiness. Garrett missed the first post-acquisition payment at the end of January. Tobias sent a standard notice. In February, Garrett's attorney contacted Meridian requesting a loan modification and extension. Tobias negotiated a modified structure that gave Whitmore Holdings 3 additional months in exchange for a reporting covenant and partial payment. It was the appropriate professional response. We were not in the business of unnecessary acceleration, but the modified payment schedule required performance, and Cloverfield Commons was not performing. In January, on a Wednesday evening, my cousin Renata called me. Renata was 32, Aunt Ruth's daughter, one of the few people in the extended family who had maintained genuine contact with me throughout the years of managed distance. She said, "Cassie, I need to tell you something and I don't want you hearing it from someone else first." She read me Noelle's wedding guest list from an email my mother had circulated. 112 names. My aunt on my father's side. A dozen cousins. The Berkeleys from next door, whom I had met perhaps 4 times in my adult life. The woman who directed Noelle's church choir. The man who had maintained the estate's grounds for the past 11 years. Not me. I said, "Thank you for telling me, Renata." I said it evenly, the way you say things when you have already made your decision, and the new information confirms, rather than creates it. I said, "Please don't mention you called, okay?" She said she wouldn't. We stayed on the phone for a few more minutes talking about other things. Her daughter's first year of school, the way the winter had been harder than usual. And then we said goodnight, and I set the phone on the kitchen counter and made tea, and stood at the window looking at the city lights for a long time. The wedding was set for the 2nd Saturday of April. The guest list had been finalized. The invitations had gone out. I had been classified, at the family level, as a person whose absence from a significant family event was not only acceptable, but preferable. They had, in a document they circulated among relatives and neighbors and the estate's groundskeeper, made the non-priority designation official. The next morning, I sent an email to Tobias marked routine. I asked him to confirm the current payment status on BRH7741W and the precise timeline for triggering formal default proceedings under the terms of the modified loan agreement. He responded by 11. Garrett was 58 days past due on the modified payment schedule. The cure period under the modification would expire in 32 days. Standard default notice and the initiation of foreclosure proceedings would follow automatically unless payment or a new refinancing proposal was received. Payment was not received. If you are still here, if you have listened to every word of this so far, I want you to pause for a moment with me. Have you ever been in a position where you had to decide whether to speak or whether to simply let the truth find its own room? Have you ever watched a situation develop and understood, very clearly, that the most powerful thing you could do was nothing? Just be present, be documented, and be patient? Drop a comment. Tell me what you chose. And if this story is doing something to you, if it is landing in some specific way, subscribe to Revenge Diary. We release a new story every single day, and every one of them is told by a woman who understood that composure is a strategy, not a surrender. Now let me tell you about the 22 weeks between January and the 2nd Saturday of April, and what I was doing while my family addressed wedding invitations and arranged centerpieces and planned a celebration that did not include my name. I was working, methodically, precisely, without drama. Tobias filed the formal default notice on the second Wednesday of February, 29 days before the wedding date. The notice went to Whitmore Holdings, registered office address, and to Philip Hartley's firm as the attorney of record for the collateral agreement. It was 4 pages of standard legal language, formatted exactly as Meridian formatted every default notice in our portfolio. It specified the amount owed, the cure period, the actions available to the borrower, and the timeline for foreclosure proceedings if no resolution was achieved. Nothing in it was unusual. Nothing in it was personal. It was a document. And it said what documents say. Hartley's office called Tobias within 24 hours. Tobias reported back to me that Hartley had expressed surprise and asked whether there was any flexibility in the timeline or an appetite for further modification. Tobias had been professional and precise. Meridian would review any substantive refinancing proposals submitted within the cure period. No other flexibility existed within the terms of the agreement. There was no substantive refinancing proposal. Garrett was exploring options. I knew this from Renata, who had heard it from my aunt, who had overheard a phone conversation at the estate one Sunday. But the regional lenders he approached were unwilling to extend new credit against a development project with no anchor tenant and no completed units. The cure period elapsed. The 30-day clock began. I decided during those weeks that I wanted to be present for the notification, not because I needed to see it happen, but because I had, for 34 years, been absent from the rooms where decisions about my family were made. I had been told, in various forms and with various levels of gentleness, that I had built my life somewhere else, and that they had all adjusted. I wanted to stop adjusting. I wanted to be in the room, professionally, legally, appropriately, and I wanted Philip Hartley to look across a table and understand exactly who he was looking at. I drove to Harlan County on the Wednesday morning, 5 days before the wedding, the same day as the rehearsal dinner. I want to be clear that I did not time this around the rehearsal dinner. The cure period expired when it expired, and the meeting date was set by mutual availability, and the calendar was what the calendar was. I am telling you this, not to disclaim responsibility for the effect, but because the truth is more interesting than the alternative. I did not need to engineer the timing. The timing was the natural consequence of events that my family had set in motion long before I arrived in that conference room. I arrived at Hartley's office at 9:45 in the morning. The building was a handsome red brick structure on Main Street in downtown Harlan, the kind of building that communicates stability and discretion. The conference room on the 14th floor had a window that faced south. On a clear day, you could see the hills beyond the county line. It was a clear day. Hartley came in at 10 past 10. He was in his mid-60s. A careful man, well-dressed, someone who had managed the Whitmore family's legal affairs for long enough that he had developed, I suspected, a comfortable sense of the family's internal geography and his own position within it. He sat down and opened his folder, and then he looked at me. Really looked at me, the kind of look that happens when a person's brain is revising something, and said carefully, "Cassandra, I wasn't expecting you to be the principal." I said, "I understand. The acquisition was handled through the company. I wanted to meet in person, as a courtesy." Given the relationship, he said, "I see." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your brother doesn't know it's you, does he?" It was not quite a question. I said, "The notices have gone to the registered address and to your office. Everything has been done correctly." He said, "Of course." He looked at his folder. He looked at me again. He said, "How long have you held this loan?" I said, 38 months. He set his pen down. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. We reviewed the status. We confirmed the timeline. I instructed the bank officer present to issue the standard notices. I requested that everything proceed exactly as it would for any other borrower in the portfolio. No special accommodations, no deviations from standard process, nothing that could be characterized later as either punitive or preferential. When I stood to leave, Hartley rose as well. He said, "Cassandra." I looked at him. He said, "I want you to know I didn't realize when the original collateral agreement was drawn up. I didn't realize you were." He stopped. I said, "You did your job, Mr. Hartley. I'm doing mine." I thanked the receptionist at the front desk. I took the elevator down. I sat in my car in the parking structure for 4 minutes with the engine off and my hands flat on my thighs. and my eyes on the concrete wall in front of me. Then I drove to a diner 2 blocks away and ordered eggs and coffee and read the local paper because I was hungry and because it was a Wednesday morning and because the most powerful thing a person can do after a consequential action is refuse to treat it as more dramatic than it is. The calls reached Hartley before noon. He was in the hallway outside the conference room when his phone rang. I could hear the rhythm of his voice through the partially open door, controlled, professional, delivering information to someone who was not receiving it well. Renata called me that evening. She said that Garrett had taken a phone call during the first course of the rehearsal dinner and returned to the table 35 minutes later looking, she searched for the word, hollowed. She said my mother had kept smiling, but her eyes had gone remote, like a light being redirected somewhere interior. She said Petra had been very still. She said Fletcher had looked confused. She said Noelle had kept talking about the flowers. I said, I'm sorry the dinner was disrupted, Renata. She paused. She said quietly, Cassie, is it yours? I said, I'll explain everything. Just not tonight. She said, okay. She had always trusted me. From the time we were children, Renata had trusted me in that specific way that some people extend to you, not because you've earned it in any demonstrable way, but because they simply know. She knew. The wedding happened on the Saturday. I know this because Renata sent me a photograph. Noelle in the white dress, Fletcher beside her, my parents at the reception table looking composed and slightly ashen in equal measure, Garrett's jaw tight, Petra's posture rigid. The south lawn was visible through the reception tent, decorated beautifully, the grounds immaculate, the estate looking exactly as it always had. What the photograph could not show was what that lawn now represented in the paperwork filed at the Harlan County Circuit Court. But I looked at it for a long time anyway. I thought about my grandfather building the main house. I thought about my grandmother's roses along the east wall. I thought about being 14 and sitting on the porch steps at dusk while the adults talked inside, understanding even then that the inside of things was not quite where I lived. I went to bed at 10 that Saturday evening. I slept without dreaming. Garrett called on Sunday at 9:17 in the morning. I let it go to voicemail. His message was 6 minutes and 40 seconds long. He began calmly in the register of a man who believes he can still reason his way through something, and ended in a register I recognized from childhood. The controlled fury of someone who has never been accustomed to a circumstance he did not author. He used the word sabotage twice. He said I had weaponized a legal mechanism against his family. He said our grandfather would be horrified. He did not, at any point in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, mention the engagement dinner. He did not mention the unopened bottle of Barolo. He did not mention the wedding guest list with 112 names and one notable absence. My mother called at 11:52. 40 seconds. She said, Cassandra, I don't understand what you've done. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. Her voice was not angry. It was confused in a very specific way, the confusion of a person whose model of the world has produced an output that the model does not account for. In her model, I was manageable. Non-priority daughters do not acquire your family's debt. That was not in the model. Noelle called on Monday morning. I answered. She said, Cassie, I want you to know I didn't know you weren't on the list. Mom handled the invitations. I just want you to know that. I listened without interrupting. I said, thank you for saying that. She said, is there anything you can do? About the estate, I said the proceedings follow statute. The appropriate path would be a refinancing proposal submitted through proper channels. She said, Cassie? And then she stopped. There was a silence on the line that was longer than most silences between us. Then she said, I'm sorry you weren't at the wedding. I said, I know. We stayed on the phone for a moment without speaking. Then I said, take care of yourself, Noelle, and ended the call. What followed was 6 weeks of mediation. Garrett retained new legal counsel, a firm out of Richmond, and filed for emergency mediation through the circuit court. The mediator's office contacted Meridian Capital Partners and requested a conference. I attended with Tobias. Garrett came with his attorney, without Petra, and he looked different from any version of himself I could recall. Not diminished exactly, but repositioned, like a piece of furniture moved to a different part of the room. The composure he had always carried with the ease of a man who had never questioned his own centrality. That composure was present but effortful in a way it had never been before. He was working to hold it. I recognized the effort because I had spent 34 years making the same one, and I knew what it cost. He did not look at me directly at first. In the first session, he addressed himself primarily to the mediator, and when he spoke of the loan and the default, He used the language of administrative error, a timing issue, an unfortunate sequence of market conditions, a project that was still viable given the right bridge financing. His attorney was polished and thorough. He presented a picture of Whitmore Holdings as a temporarily distressed but fundamentally solvent entity with a clear path to resolution. Tobias listened. He took notes. He asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one landing in a slightly different place than Garrett's attorney expected. By the end of the first session, the contours of the negotiation were clear to everyone in the room. In the second session, Garrett looked at me directly. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I did not have a name for. Not anger, not shame, something more complicated than either. Something that might have been the specific discomfort of recognizing that you have spent years misreading a situation. I held his gaze without adding anything to it. I let the silence do what silence does. Over 4 sessions, spanning 6 weeks, we arrived at a structured refinancing arrangement that gave Whitmore Holdings 22 months to retire the debt at a fixed rate, subject to conditions: monthly financial reporting to Meridian, third-party oversight of the Cloverfield Commons development, and a second lien on the project itself. The estate was removed from direct jeopardy. The family could keep the house. I could have forced the foreclosure to completion. The statute permitted it, the documentation supported it, and the timeline was on my side. But I want you to understand something that I think gets lost when people tell stories like this one. It was never about taking the house. The house was never the point. The point was the room. The point was standing in a room they could not manage me out of, and being recognized, not as a resource, not as a non-priority, not as the daughter who had built her life somewhere else and therefore had been adjusted around, but as a person of consequence who had been there, building, the entire time. The foreclosure proceeding had put me in that room. The refinancing agreement confirmed that I belonged there. That was enough. My mother called me 3 weeks after the mediation concluded. It was a Sunday morning, and her voice was different from any version of it I had heard in 34 years. Not warm exactly, but deliberate, in the way of someone who has recently determined that deliberateness is necessary. She said she would like me to come for dinner the following month, if I was willing. I said I appreciated that. She said, "Cassandra, I want you to know," and then she stopped. The breath she took was the kind that is really a recalibration, a pause that acknowledges something without yet naming it. She said, "I would have done things differently." With the list, the guest list, it shouldn't have happened the way it did. I said, "Mom, it wasn't an oversight." Silence. Long enough to be real. Then she said, quietly, "No, it wasn't." That acknowledgement, 2 syllables, no more, was the closest Vivienne Elaine Whitmore had ever come to an apology directed at me. I did not press it. I did not list every engagement dinner and unopened bottle of wine and graduation that had gone unattended. I let the 2 syllables be what they were, a door opening a crack. I decided I would see what was on the other side. I went to dinner the following month. I brought wine. Noel was there, and Fletcher, and Garrett and Petra, and my father in his chair by the window. When I came through the door, my father looked up and said, quite clearly, "There she is." It was the most he had said in 2 years. It landed in the room with a weight I did not expect. We sat at the long table. The conversation was careful, and occasionally awkward, and sometimes almost ordinary. My mother passed me the bread before she passed it to Noel. She did it without thinking, or perhaps she did it very deliberately. I could not tell, and I found that I did not need to. What I knew was that it happened. And I noticed, and she noticed that I noticed, and for a moment we looked at each other across the table with the specific acknowledgement of 2 people who understand that something has shifted, and that neither of them is quite certain yet what to do about it. We are not fixed. I want to be honest with you about that, because these stories are sometimes told as though the ending is an arrival, a door that opens, a table that finally has the right seats arranged around it, everything resolved into warmth. That is not what happened. The Whitmore family does not fix. It adjusts, slowly, under the pressure of events and time and the occasional, irrefutable fact. The adjustments are imperfect, and sometimes awkward, and occasionally genuine. I have learned to be present for the genuine ones, and patient with the imperfect ones, because the alternative is to continue standing outside the window looking at the light inside, which I did for long enough and am no longer willing to do. Garrett and I spoke privately after that dinner, standing on the porch in the cool evening air while the others finished dessert inside. He said, "I didn't know it was you, on the loan." I said, "I know." He had his hands in his pockets the way he used to when we were children, and he was thinking about something he didn't want to say out loud. Then he said, "How long have you been running that firm?" I said, 6 years. Another pause. He looked at the grounds, the dark lawn stretching toward the tree line, the south lawn, where weeks before 200 people had danced at a wedding I had not been invited to. He said, "We missed a lot." I said, "You did, not we." He heard the distinction. He absorbed it without defending himself, which was more than I had expected, and I gave him credit for it. Noelle called me the following week. Not about the estate, not about the legal proceedings, just a call. We talked for 40 minutes. She told me about a trip she and Fletcher were planning, and a garden she was starting to put in at their new house. At one point she said, "I used to think you were the one who pulled away." I did not correct her immediately. Then I said, "I want you to think about why you thought that." She was quiet. Then she said, "Yeah, I know." That was the most honest thing Noelle had said to me in years, and I held it carefully, the way you hold something that has traveled a long way to reach you. My mother and I have had 4 dinners since the mediation concluded. Each one is better than the last in small, measurable ways. She asks, now, about what I am working on. The questions are tentative and sometimes imprecise, but she asks, and that is something she did not do before. Last month she said at the end of a Sunday dinner, "I think your grandfather would have understood what you do." I said, "I think so too." We looked at each other for a moment across the dinner table, and I understood that we were both thinking about the same person. The man who built the house we were sitting in, who had put his name on that deed and trusted his son to honor it, and whose granddaughter had, in the end, been the one paying closest attention. I am not telling you this story because everything is fixed. I am telling you this story because I think there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being good at something no one in your life has noticed, and I think that loneliness is more common than it should be. And I think the answer is not to stop being good at the thing, but to build it so completely and so carefully that one day it speaks for itself in a room the people who missed it cannot avoid. I am telling you this story because I believe that the women who are called non-priority, who are allocated rather than loved, who drive 4 hours to dinners and carry wine that no one opens, need to hear that the answer is not the confrontation. It is not the speech at the dinner table. It is not the tearful phone call demanding to be seen. The answer is the work. The quiet, specific, documented, patient, compounding work of becoming the person who cannot be ignored, in rooms that matter, on terms that are yours. You build it while they are not watching. You build it while they are planning parties and addressing invitations and circulating guest lists that do not include you. And when the room finally appears, the room they cannot manage you out of, you walk into it calmly with your documents in order, and you say what needs to be said in the plainest possible language. They will see you, maybe not immediately, maybe not in the form you imagined, but they will see you. And when they do, you will not need to explain how long you have been standing there. The work will have been doing that for years. If you are somewhere in this story, if you know what it is to be the family's non-priority, to be loved efficiently and allocated carefully and noticed only when you are of use, I want you to hear this directly. You are not waiting. You are preparing. The preparation is the answer. And the answer takes the form it takes in its own time. What would you have done if you had been left off that list? Would you have called and demanded an explanation, stayed quiet, and moved on? Or would you have let the work speak in a room your family couldn't ignore? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you have made it to the very end of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Someone who understands that the quietest women sometimes carry the most irreversible truths, and that composure is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of strategy. At Revenge Diary, we release a new story every single day. Each one is told by a woman who decided that building was more powerful than breaking, that patience was more effective than performance, that the room they couldn't manage her out of was worth constructing one careful year at a time. If that resonates with you, if something in this story met you where you live, please subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. The woman who feels invisible right now needs to know she is not alone. I will see you in the next one.